Good morning, everybody. We're going to begin our next breakout session here. I am joined up here by Nicholas Anastasi from Sprocket Security, who's going to be talking to us about the art of account compromise, I believe. Official title, pen tester. So one of our lovely red team oriented people is going to be giving us some interesting insight into account compromise today. So without further ado, one logistic question or logistic statement I would say is just for time's sake, if we could hold Q&A until roughly near the end of the presentation, maybe the last slide or two, or if we get to the Q&A slide itself. So without further ado, Nicholas?
Yeah, awesome. Let's see here. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great, awesome. So like you said, Nicholas Anastasi, penetration tester at Sprocket Security, and today we're going to be talking about what I'm calling the art of account compromise, but really kind of the attack chain when we work with an organization, kind of in the modern security landscape. So yeah, quick overview. Nicholas Anastasi, spent a lot of time working on offensive tool development and making penetration testing better at scale. So really quick plug for the company that I'm at, Sprocket Security. We're a local firm, and if anybody here is with an org that's had a penetration test before, probably used to that 2-week kind of penetration test, and then you never have anything done after that, or you wait till the next year to actually work with the company again. Attackers continuously work to attack company assets, and so what we do is we spend the entire year engaged with the client to identify issues and report on them. So yeah, the quick stat here, kind of a quick overview. There's a report, a threat intel report from Verizon that came out not that long ago, and just kind of in review of 2021, found that 61% of data breaches, ransomware events started with account compromise. So really what that's saying is every single attack, or a large majority of the attacks that we see out there in the real world, kind of lean on the ability for an attacker to guess a password or compromise an account and then work towards the internal network or whatever they end up wanting to do. So what we're going to do real quick is talk about the authentication landscape in the past, maybe 10 years ago versus now. When we're looking into the past at, for example, password policies or what passwords employees at companies were generally using, we would see that staff were, everybody was using the default out-of-the-box Active Directory password policy with 7-character passwords with little to no complexity in them. Hopefully that's changed, but additionally, just looking at authentication or the process of authentication to access mail resources, whatever it may be, to get an employee's job done. We saw little to no multi-factor authentication implementation, either because the actual MFA software suites didn't support everything, so you couldn't implement it across the board, or it was very hard there were no defined processes to get users on board, right, with the idea of having to pick up their phone to log into something. Additionally here, and this is also, we'll talk about how it is now, but the ability to detect and then respond to a compromised account was much more difficult 10 years back versus now. Now in 2022, fast forwarding to taking a look at like the modern authentication landscape, what it looks like logging in from an employee's perspective, right? We are seeing stronger password policies. Albeit not as good as we'd like to see, but we recommend at Sprocket 14+ character passwords with definite levels of complexity. In the real world, we see maybe 8 to 12 with the level of complexity mixed in there. Really depends on the industry and the type of organization. And additionally, we are seeing MFA implemented more and more. That's especially true as companies shift to cloud-based services and federated identity providers like O365 for their general mail services, or to Okta, Ping Identity, Auth0, those type of providers. And then finally, built right into a lot of, again, those identity providing solutions, we're seeing the ability to detect and respond to account compromise, or other internal security suites are much more capable at actually alerting staff that an account was compromised. So okay, as an attacker, right, how do I deal with that in 2022, right? I can't, it's much more difficult for me to password spray Office 365 and try to guess user credentials or target Okta directly, which is next to impossible right now. Instead, what we opt to do is kind of go back 10 years ago, right? Everybody used Microsoft Exchange and other services and actually hosted their employee kind of business operation services on premises, right? So Exchange was exclusively hosted in-house, or employees would log in there and they'd be able to get to company mail services. Now, even after organizations have shifted to Azure AD and O365, we're still seeing legacy Microsoft products, and legacy is not based on my interpretation of it, but more Microsoft and Okta in their documentation has started to call things like Exchange, and then the things we'll talk about in later slides, a form of legacy authentication because it can't be easily protected by modern security controls. Under this umbrella too of kind of legacy products that a lot of people here might be familiar with, Microsoft Exchange, RD Web, ADFS in certain configurations, and Skype for Business or Link are all very juicy to us as attackers. When we start to scope a client and we see it, we get excited because we know we're going to be able to password spray without dealing with cloud services and other security providers. So as an attacker, right, we see these, we can either, one, through the web interfaces of all of these platforms, we can do username enumeration to make our password spraying process a lot more accurate, but then also we can, password spray directly here and just attempt to guess passwords with little to no interaction from an external control. And there are a lot of post-exploitation tactics surrounding these as well. So now jumping the fence, let's go even further back or kind of go deeper into what we can do to password spray endpoints that organizations we're working with. So we get even more excited when we see NTLM over HTTP endpoints. These type of endpoints are exposed on all the products that I listed in the past slide, but also can be exposed anywhere. Essentially, like real quick, NTLM over HTTP allows me as a user to authenticate to a web endpoint using my Active Directory credentials and then potentially access internal resources, right? So the thing that I call out here specifically, Exchange Web Services, this is the one everybody in the room has probably used an application that would interact with this, the Apple Mail app. Still to an extent, and I know at least a year, 2 years ago, was still using EWS to access services, and Microsoft exposes it still on Outlook.office365.com for that reason. But EWS is very difficult to protect with MFA. At best, you can block login attempts that aren't coming in from your SSO provider and things like that. But this is great for us to password spray and try to guess credentials targeting it. So we can bypass MFA using this just based on misconfigurations. Very easy for us to password spray. We can programmatically determine if a login was successful or not, super duper easily. And then, additionally, it's exposed on nearly every Exchange server in the world, right? So it's needed for legacy applications or, like I said, Apple Mail apps that just don't support the modern authentication processes. So this is kind of like a high-level overview before I hop into, I'm going to do a couple little case studies, and if you guys have questions as I'm going through those, I totally am ready to hear them. I think those will generate the most questions. But as a tester, right, when we start an engagement with a client, we do our reconnaissance. We've built internal tooling to just really quickly identify Microsoft Exchange endpoints, ADFS endpoints, and then see what we're actually able to do with them based on their configuration. We'll enumerate that information. For one, we can, I can hop back here real quick for a second. Just going to give me a pointer. If we show here under target info there, or kind of in this screenshot here, we can pull the internal domain while targeting EWS. We can get the version of Windows Server running, do a lot of fun stuff. So we enumerate that information for password spraying. We perform password spraying with EWS. Or any type of NTLM over HTTP endpoint, we're not rate limited. I don't think I've ever run into it during an engagement. So we'll spin up a list of maybe 300, 400 passwords and just let it run slowly over the course of a week, 2 weeks. And the awesome part about continuous, what we do at Sprocket, I can do this year-round against an organization. So as soon as a new account pops up, or one account gets its password reset to password 1 for whatever reason, we're able to hop on it really quickly. And then following that, you have credentials, and very often that'll lead to compromise of the internal network of the client that you're working with, or other things. So yeah, some mini case studies. Again, if anybody has questions, just pipe up here and let me know. But these are based on real world engagements that I did in the past year or so, kind of piecing together things to build a good narrative. So they're not exactly, but should give us some good insight into the attack path. I will note, I have it up there at the top, but this whole thing here was about like 12 hours of work or something like that. So it went very quickly. We engaged a client for an external penetration test. Client was in the just based on our kickoff call and conversation with the client, they were in the process of migrating completely to O365, and we knew they had Duo implemented for MFA. With that, we still went through and enumerated services that were hosted on premises for the client. Found an Exchange server, even though it was not being actively used whatsoever to the best of our knowledge. Went ahead, targeted EWS, successfully guessed credentials, and then come to find out, right, we go to log into that Exchange server. There are no mailboxes hosted there. They had all been migrated to the cloud. So you're like, okay, what do we do if I go try to log into O365 to actually get to this user's mailbox and do things? I'm going to be blocked. I'll be hit with this Duo MFA prompt, right? So we've come to find out with testing, some MFA providers are better than others, right? So Duo, once you implement it, feels safe. You log in through the browser, and you get hit with this prompt. You have to either approve a push or answer a call, et cetera, et cetera. But like I mentioned earlier on in the slides, O365 still exposes that EWS endpoint for authentication over NTLM over HTTP. So Duo doesn't care about that. It doesn't have the capabilities to actually prompt for Duo there. So programmatically then, just from a terminal, we can directly look at or point our tooling at Outlook and log in and read from the user's mailbox and mail on their behalf. It's just kind of, and if anybody asks like, okay, how do you fix this? Unfortunately, it's switch vendor, because from what I understand, there's not a lot of options here, at least if you are utilizing Duo for MFA. Regardless, this is unrelated now to actual, like what the talk is about centrally, but once we had guest credentials, there was a misconfigured VPN appliance, a Cisco SSL VPN. We went ahead, logged in there. It was misconfigured in the sense that MFA wasn't required for a specific group there listed for the SSL VPN, and gained access to the internal network. We went through the motions and got domain administrator and access to the internal network. So in about 12 hours, client went from not compromised to full access, and if I was an actual malicious actor, it would be full internal network takeover. Additionally here, this is a really neat one that I do want to call out. Before I dive into the case study, I want to give a quick overview of what ActiveSync is. So Microsoft has made a lot of very interesting things in their time, but ActiveSync stands out as one of the oddest decisions they've made on a service that I've ever seen, at least. So ActiveSync was originally built to allow mobile phones to authenticate to Exchange and mail services, right? And that was before like modern smartphones. This was back with BlackBerries and things, like before a smartphone. It was almost there. And during the design of ActiveSync, they added the ability to see your calendar, make modifications, read from your mailbox, send mail. But then they also implemented the ability to read from internal network shares. So while authenticating to ActiveSync, if the user has a mailbox in Exchange and I have valid credentials, I can hit a endpoint on an Exchange server, and it's exposed on nearly every Exchange server we've worked with, and directly list the contents of network shares without ever stepping foot on the internal network, which is huge, right? That's exfiltration of PII that logging is almost definitely not going to be able to see. So we went kind of to step back here. engaged with the client for an external penetration test. We knew that all of their mail services were on-prem just based on our conversations with them. Guest credentials on this engagement specifically, we got very lucky just with the credentials that we ended up guessing, but found that ActiveSync was exposed on the Exchange server, read from internal network shares. We performed another attack against Exchange called a DNT dump. It essentially is like it's a dump of Active Directory listings from Exchange using credentials that was kind of developed as a process in the past year or so. But with that, we're able to grab a list of internal hosts, right? So we can get server names like Dell FS03 and et cetera, et cetera. We take that list and we go through and we say, okay, this user that I'm authenticating to Exchange with, what servers did they have the ability to read from network shares? And spidering through these network shares, and I'll mind you, this is probably the slowest process I go through at testing, trying to browse a network share programmatically through a terminal on a network you've never worked on before is not a quick process. And that's why I think this one, yeah, I spent about a day doing that before I got to the point that discovered an Excel spreadsheet. It was shared by IT staff for usernames and passwords. Not a very mature internal security kind of policy there, but grabbed that Excel spreadsheet, reading through it, found an MSP for an IT provider that did work for them here and there. And the account that they were using to log into the VPN to manage the internal network was not provisioned for MFA because multiple employees would need to use it, and they only had SMS-based MFA provisioned for their employees. So took those credentials, logged into the VPN, again, went through the motions, got domain administrator, and yeah, compromised the internal network off of that. So that is that. Before I hop onto the next kind of remediation and attack prevention slides, does anybody have any questions they can think of or anything they want me to go back over real quick? Yeah.
Good question. So the attack surface that you come, is it primarily on-prem Exchange, or does this impact O365 as well?
Yeah, so primarily it affects on-prem Exchange implementations, but we will take credentials we guess on-prem against an on-prem service and then go ahead and leverage it on cloud services, right? So Exchange in the cloud, I don't believe any, not that I can think of, no. But we also will only run into O365. Generally, I don't see Exchange servers hosted like in Azure. That's pretty rare for me to run into. So yeah, definitely good question, good question. Anybody else? Okay, awesome. So let's talk remediation and attack prevention. The first one has probably been getting thrown at you guys for the past 5 years. Everybody knows it, but you know, based on my experience, and I bet everybody here's experience, easier said than done, right? So at Sprocket, we recommend companies push a 14+ character password policy across the board for all users. What we'll find during testing is there will be, even though they have a 14 character policy for all users in the domain, or all domain users have it enforced, we'll still find service accounts that have like hard set passwords that fall outside of this. So even if Jay Smith is using a 14 character password and every time they reset it, they have to use a 14 character password policy, or a 14 character password, test mail or whatever it may end up being that was provisioned 5 years ago is still using password 1. So even if you do have a strong policy implemented, you need to make sure that all users across the board are utilizing that strong password policy. So additionally, and this is kind of a general rule of thumb for shoring up security posture, right? Not only, well, in general, we want to reduce our attack surface on the internet, right? If a new exploit or vulnerability comes out, we don't want an attacker to be able to look at our services, find one that wasn't exploitable 6 months ago, and now all of a sudden they're able to get remote code execution on it, or whatever it may be. But that also goes for legacy Microsoft products. If you've shifted to O365 completely for mail, your Exchange server doesn't need to be on the internet for everybody to access, right? So there are there's documentation Microsoft provides to actually restrict access between that Exchange server and the cloud that is very useful. Just, yeah, look to reduce your attack surface. Additionally, utilize robust multi-factor authentication solutions whenever possible. I won't go into this too much, but we do recommend using code-based MFA as opposed to push-based MFA solutions. I have to call somebody and pretend to be IT to get that code, right? But if from an attacker's perspective, but if there's a push, I just send it 20 times while attempting to log in, and eventually they'll approve it. So fourth here, if possible, it really depends on the size of the organization. Look to contract some federated identity service provider to defend against password spraying attacks. For example, Okta, I know they're here today and I'm plugging them a lot, but it's what they do for a living. They protect the authentication process. They make sure I can't target it to guess passwords. And in my experience, they're really good at that, right? So we want to look to utilize those services wherever possible because they have the detection and defense capabilities built right in. And then finally, this is a little bit, if you had to start today, right? Do you have a solution for monitoring anomalous logins, or do you keep an eye on users logging in from odd locations or from the first time to your Active Directory infrastructure? So even if you're not 100% sure, you're at a giant organization with a /16 out on the internet or something, and you don't know if you have an Exchange server sitting out there, you can watch to make sure somebody isn't password spraying it from the same location, and then all of a sudden they're able to guess a credential. So yeah, that is that. I think the wrap-up question is, I hope everybody kind of walks back and says, okay, well maybe my organization is leaving these services out there, and it doesn't seem like a risk because Microsoft made it, and that's should be fine. But yeah, kind of in review. So.
Awesome.
Yeah, definitely.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Questions outside of what have already been asked, and we don't have a roaming mic in this room, so we'll have to use our big people voice. Who's first, Dave?
You've went through a lot, but what's the biggest, when you're talking to people like us and stuff like that, we're trying to do stuff, what's the biggest problem or biggest mistake you see us making when we're trying to do this?
Yeah, so are you out of the remediation and stuff here? Do you have one specifically you're talking about?
Overall, when we're as an organization, what mistake do we make the most often? And you're seeing from a pen test that most everybody is making that we think we're doing right, but we're not.
Yeah, they're throwing that. I mean, it surrounds the password policy most likely, right? So we will slap on that 14-character requirement. We'll say, okay, every user in the next 90 days when they reset their password, they have to choose a 14+ character password. But we find that users opt to then all of a sudden use summertime 2021 as their password because it meets the requirements, but is also very predictable. And so utilizing either a third-party service or Azure AD directly to ban specific passwords is huge, right? We want to make the passwords less predictable. Or the other issue we run into there, right? I kind of mentioned it a little bit, service accounts that have their passwords set to never expire, right? And they just get left behind. Still able to guess that credential, still able to use it to do things. And so that, even though it feels like we changed the password policy, in reality, it's most often, or very likely not the case until a penetration test happens and tells you that that's how it is. So, yeah, definitely. Good question, good question.
Awesome. Other questions? Everybody's got all this stuff down, locked.
There's always this contention of ease of access and security. How do you overcome this? To your point, the MFA is what you said. At some point, somebody's going to just click.
Yes.
Make it happen. And really, every technology that we bring has a level of escalation to this. Now we have another
So,
balance that and manage that. One, to provide ease of access, and two, to secure it.
yeah, definitely. You're asking an age-old question, how to walk that fence, right, where your users can actually do their job easily and quickly, because that's right, we want the business to continue. Security can't get in the way of that, or we want to try to not get in the way of that as much as possible. But at the same time, when you add security controls, very often you'll add friction, and you see the companies that are very, very successful, they're able to add the control but not add the friction, right? So Again, I would say the in-between here is probably, like, best case scenario, utilizing a federated identity provider that's able to conditionally, or just Microsoft Defender for Identity, where they're able to conditionally send MFA prompts to users in certain ways based on if they feel the login is anomalous or could be malicious from a new device, et cetera, et cetera. So it probably comes down to not making the MFA policy, allowing another control to kind of dynamically determine how that's going to look. So, and we never, in reality, I've never been able to, I guess in my experience, if that's the only thing in place, if Defender for Identity is running and there's a decent password policy in place, it's very unlikely that I'm going to guess a password, but it's also pretty easy for the user to log in the morning to do their job. So, yeah. Okay. Awesome.
How do you see passwordless authentication changing this landscape?
So you mean like passwordless that we use to password spray and things? Or what are you asking exactly?
Passwordless.
Passwordless. I see. Okay, I heard you wrong. I have never seen it implemented, and I've yet to hear about an implementation that seems super viable for maybe a small organization or a startup could throw something on like that, but right now I don't get the impression that we're anywhere near widespread adoption. Again, it's kind of like walking back 10 years when MFA first came out though, where they didn't support everything and it was kind of very limited in its scope of what it could protect. But I would assume, or I'm going to go ahead and guess that as time goes on here, right, passwordless authentication will work for a larger number of orgs with more complex setups. And once we get to that point, I might end up having to steal phones for a living. I'm not 100% sure. So it really depends. I would suspect that what's good now will become bad in 5 years. We'll research the heck out of it. We'll figure out how to target it. And then when passwordless comes out, we'll just go after that stuff. I guess that's kind of a very broad answer, but security, it always evolves in what we're doing. There are still attacks coming out for Active Directory 12, 15 years after its release. So I assume that it's going to be very, very similar in that sense. So.
Are you talking passwordless according to using like biometrics or smart cards? So my biggest concern with biometrics is you can't change them. So if they get your information from biometrics, they have it. To me, it's even worse than passwords, because you can at least change the password.
Yeah.
Smart cards, yeah, I can see that, but I'm scared to death of biometrics.
Yeah. I just for physical, like security key based stuff, I did read recently, I believe it was Twitter if I remember correctly, they had a big write-up on their kind of worldwide rollout of hardware based MFA and how they did that. And I believe it was the UB keys with you at least had to physically touch it, right? Their approach to that and how they did it gave me a little bit of hope that implementation is possible, and seeing a giant org like that do it is really, really cool. I don't know if biometric will have nearly as wide of an adoption rate as just having a physical key or whatever it may be with a provider like YubiKey. So yeah, good question though. Okay, awesome.
Awesome. Well, we're right at time. Nicholas, thanks for your presentation.
Yeah, for sure.
Round of applause.
Thank you.